Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see so many of you here. We have a fun panel ahead of us on the spectre of cybersecurity and how can industry fight back. My name is James Lyon, and I'll introduce myself momentarily. But before I do, I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists here, culminating in over 100 years of relevant experience to our topic today. Starting off on my left here, I have Charles Briscoe. He has over 30 years of experience in information security. I have to admit that that's actually my age, so I'm feeling kind of slightly inadequate at this point in time. He's the founding director of FS ISAC back in 2001, as well as being the former chair of the Financial Services Security Sector Coordinating Council. Really good acronym. That was a difficult one for me. Over here on my further left, I have Steve Briscoe. He's the global head of technology and operations at LCH. 20 years in investment banking, starting off in technology and then moving over to operations. And he's all about simplifying financial services technology infrastructure. Big fan of keeping things simple when it comes to security and infrastructure. So looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Over here again, we have Kalyani Pillai. I hope I didn't mispronounce that too horribly. She's the CEO of Sabric, who deal with fighting organized crime. A long history in legal and criminal justice, really quite a profound career, and a huge proponent of information sharing in the industry, which we'll hear about a little more later. And last but certainly not least, we have Katrina Whelan over here, Head of Compliance and Controls at RBS. And I believe you've worked in payments for over 10 years. And lots of work spanning fintech, startups, working in investment banking. So again, lots and lots of relevant expertise. I myself am the geek in the room, as you might have ascertained from my failure to adhere to the dress code. My name is James Lyon. I'm the global head of research at security firm Sophos. I also teach exploit writing and development. So I spend a lot of time unpicking the cyber criminals' latest creations, figuring out what they're up to and what they're going to do next. Now, it falls to me to offer a few opening remarks before we dive into the mainstay of our panel here. And I suppose I'd like to do that by just telling you a brief couple of stories about recent experiences. I spend all my time looking at malware and exploits and phishing. Over 350,000 new pieces of malicious code a day flow through our labs where we get to see exactly what the cyber criminals are up to. And I think with 12 years of unpicking this stuff, I sometimes lose appreciation for how remarkable cybercriminals' coordination is today. I was recently with a journalist from the BBC, and he came to the office and he said, "Show me where cybercriminals sell our information. How do they make money from this stuff? Take me to the dark web." And he actually dropped his voice and went, "The dark web." Now, of course, to any of us technologists in the room, the dark web is just the internet, but it is a specific corner of it where cyber criminals kind of make money from this information. So I took him to a couple of these sites and showed him how point-and-click easy it is to buy credit cards, countless credit cards, for just a few dollars each. How these cyber criminals had user interfaces that were just trivial to use with technical support forums, and with the information they delivered with a higher standard of encryption than many of us in the legitimate business world use. The scale of professionalism is absolutely staggering. There are now over 50 products built by cybercriminals and sold to cybercriminals to make it trivial, point-and-click easy to distribute malicious code. So I don't want to spend a lot of time preaching to you about how terribly coordinated the cyber criminals are. I'm sure you're all well aware of their work, given the myriad of breaches in the news day to day. But I do want to touch on a counterpoint to this as we transition to our panel. I believe it's very easy, hearing these horror stories of cybercriminals, to throw your hands in the air and think, it's not possible to do anything about this. If you actually look at a lot of the tactics that are successful today, very often they're incredibly simple. A good friend of mine is the CEO of a small marketing business. His wife's the CFO. He received a phishing email purporting to be from the CFO, his wife. An incredibly convincing email asking to make a transfer to a particular account. Very common scam at the moment. Several of you have probably had one over the last week. He looked me dead in the eye, knowing exactly what I do, and told me the only reason he knew it was a scam is because his wife is never that polite to him. I think we can maybe do a little bit better than that from a security standpoint here in 2016, and I think it's important as we dive through today's panel to remember that whilst attackers are incredibly coordinated with these amazing tools and capabilities, often the tactics they use against us are incredibly simple. So with that, I'd like to open up our panel today with this opening question. We're here in 2016. We've been dealing with cybercrime for a long time now. It continues to escalate. Why are cybercriminals still being so successful with such simplistic tactics like kind of overt phishing? And Katrina, I'd like to pass over to you to start here.
James, I guess the key word is, as you've said, simple. It's the data, the access points that are so easy to attack. And when we think of our own industry, we all have our standard hygiene processes from an onboarding perspective, etc. And then we forget about them. And you do your I guess, one-off training once a year. We need to change that. The tone needs to come from the top in terms of security, and there needs to be a continuous I guess, education and awareness throughout our industry, not just, as I say, a 1 hour session online and then you're done. Because from what I have seen throughout my career, it is as simple as somebody gaining access to our building and pretending they have a pass to get through a door, and it is as simple as that.
Now, I think we'd all respect the importance of people as a part of a security process. But I often, when I'm called in retrospectively to a company that's experienced a breach, I'm often met with the 400-page policy that is so boring that makes your eyes bleed. And I love this stuff. How do you make a security awareness or a training process that actually engages people and makes them change how they engage with technology and spot these kinds of attacks?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it needs to be relevant and it needs to resonate with the whole audience, not just the technology department or indeed the board. Utilising actually social media, it's a tool, it's free, and it has been very, very effective. Speaking in plain English and webinars, and also taking examples. When we've recently used the Titanic as an example, I mean, who doesn't know the risks involved with the Titanic? But it has resonated from across the whole of the floor. So those are some of the tools and techniques which we have employed.
Charles, I thought you had some thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think part of what you also have to do is make it something they feel and connect with more personally. So we've actually done two things in our approach. I mean, one, we actually made a videotape where we hired actors. We have a bad guy, Vladimir, and we have a bunch of victims.
It's a good stereotype.
And we actually, yeah, well, Vladimir's from Brooklyn, by the way. But we actually sort of showed people sort of what the experience was like and what they were feeling. I mean, simple things like the bad guy turning on the camera on your laptop without the indicator light going off, all right? Or tracking your movement by installing malware on your cell phone and being able to listen into any conversation you have. Sort of seeing that happen makes it a much more personal experience. The other thing that we've done, and I don't think it's an uncommon practice today, is we spearfish our own employees. And if you click on the link or you open the Excel file and enable macros, it provides, instead of a piece of malware, an educational experience. And again, those things aren't something that's a class. It is something that people sort of feel on a much more personal level, which makes it a lot more impactful.
Yeah, I really love anytime you can take the tactics of cyber criminals, you can mirror them and put them to good use. So defanging the latest campaigns from real life and using them for educational purposes, I've seen very positive results from that. I also think, and you kind of touched on it there, the making it personal aspect. This is something a lot of organizations really don't do well. And it's a reality of life that if you give someone some advice and you say, you need to do this because otherwise you'll lose your credit card information, your username, your password, you'll compromise your friends and your family, without being insulting, the truth is that is likely to stick with them and resonate more than, in order to protect the company's data, you must adhere to these following backwards practices and stand on one leg. So I think a lot of it is about tailoring it to your audience and making it very personal to the practices they as an individual should adhere to. And often there's quite close alignment between these things, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to get good alignment because the reality is, I've been doing this for 30 years. Information security, cybersecurity, whatever you want to call it, more than anything comes down to sort of being practical. And that's true whether in your corporate environment or in your personal life.
I totally agree. Did you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's also a point I would like to make, which is given the whole API culture, it's as important to educate our customers as it is internally, because we will, we have, not more BS necessarily, but there will be experiences of external, attacks, and indeed with PSD2, and as I say, the open banking, it is important, in my opinion, that we educate our customers.
Yeah, huge numbers of people that we have to educate, a whole society of people with different attitudes, and I know we'll come back to the bigger picture shortly. I don't want to glaze by security awareness and not touch on the counterpart. They say that good security is a combination of people, process, and technology. But I often find, when I'm retrospectively called in an incident, that people are running a very 1990s stack of security. Like, it's a bit of antivirus, a bit of patching, the odd bit of password advice. But there's a wealth of new controls and new capabilities out there. Charles, I'm interested in your thoughts with that, 30 years of experience. Why do you think we've struggled to see adoption of some of those new things? Are they not valuable? Is there some other reason behind it?
Well, I think they're insanely valuable. 30 years ago, and if you take the technologies you just mentioned, we lived under this false belief that we could prevent bad things from happening, right? No matter how good a security program you have, there's never going to be any assurance of perfection. And so we had a huge preponderance of the investments we made very focused on protection. Like you said, antivirus, patching, firewalls. These are all necessary things, but the reality is a well-balanced security program is going to think about protection, detection, and your reaction process, whether it's response, remediation, however you want to sort of describe that. And there are a lot of very good emergent technologies that are very focused on things like detection. Most bad guys, when they get into a victim's network, are there for 6 months, 7 months, or more. They're moving around laterally around your network. There's a whole emerging class of technologies that's designed not to prevent that movement, but to help you detect that movement very rapidly and with a high efficiency. But you have to be sort of willing in the security space to take a little bit of a chance. So this is, I'm going to fly against the face of simplicity here, in that a lot of the most interesting cutting-edge technology in the security space come from relatively small companies. and you've got to be able to manage the risk of those vendors as part of your program. Some companies are comfortable managing that risk because of the security benefit. Others are not, and every organization has its own risk tolerance.
Right, I think it's not a one size fits all. That's certainly true. I do think that overt focus on prevention is a key takeaway. A lot of organizations haven't moved to that place where they're investing in controls for when it goes wrong, which I think is really wise today. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of the saying there's no 100% in security. You do everything right and you can still be an unfortunate victim. So I think focusing on those areas of detection and response makes complete sense. And following on from that, Steve, I want to bring you in here. I often see a new chief information security officer or respective security role being appointed. They're there for all of 5 minutes. An inevitable breach occurs, and they're fired. Tell me about why that happens and what we're doing wrong as security professionals or as the board in that relationship such that these people aren't lasting.
Sure. I mean, I think really this is about bringing cybersecurity into the mainstream and starting to debunk some of the complexity about it so we can make it real for people. Digitization has become a reality, a part of life. We don't call using Amazon cyber shopping anymore. We probably don't even call it online shopping. It's just shopping. When we book our airline tickets online, we're just booking flights. We're not doing a particular cyber activity. It's just part of life. And in our organizations in financial services, cyber risk is just as prevalent as market risk or counterparty risk. And it needs to be managed in just the same way. It can't be eradicated. It needs to be managed. And as you heard Charles say, this is about when and not if. So how many of your boards have a zero appetite for cyber impacts? There's probably quite a few out there. But to have a zero appetite doesn't give you the tools that you need to respond, because it focuses entirely on prevention rather than on how you respond when a problem does happen. So boards need to set some sort of cyber appetite. Maybe I'll do a quick straw poll in the audience here. So how many people have an Apple device?
Let's just bring the lights up a tad and see it. Oh, yeah, that's...
Quite a few. How many? Leave your hands up. Leave your hands up, sorry. How many of you know what two-factor authentication is? This is a room full of cyber people. How many of you have it switched on your Apple device?
Good honesty there. Yeah, that's dropped by 60%, I'd say.
So there's an appetite. Apple default you to not having it switched on, yet they recommend that you switch it on. But they know that when you switch it on, your experience becomes a little bit more complex, a little bit more difficult to use. So we need to get the language into the boardroom to make these trade-offs. And I think the way to do that is to talk about the impacts, to start talking, rather than this cyber thing, which is different, let's talk about the impacts of what goes on. Let's talk about data theft. Let's talk about actual monetary theft. And then let's look at the mechanisms by which bad people can do that, one of which is the cyber route. And it's interesting how an organization that has had a cyber impact is portrayed as the perpetrator, whereas an organization that's had a more conventional means attack is viewed as the victim. So if somebody drives a transit van into your bank and steals £200,000 out of the ATM, the bank is the victim. If somebody does that online, it's the bank that has failed to protect the money. And that stigma, I think you heard, if you were in the plenary session yesterday, you'd have heard Ginny Rometty talking about the stigma that attaches to cyber is different to the rest of the world. So we need to make it mainstream. We need to demystify it, and we need to get boards making appetite decisions Because if a board says zero appetite, the only way to really implement zero appetite is to take all of your servers, all of your desktops, all of your mobile devices, put them in a big container, wrap chains around it and go and drop it somewhere in the sea, an undisclosed point. Then you're probably pretty close to zero cyber.
Which does sound like a lot of fun, frankly.
But we tried it. It didn't work very well for our customers.
There's still the risk that it's found and someone gets access to the information.
Yeah.
A couple of things that you said there really struck a chord with me. I read a lot of incident reports that are directed to boards, and it's very common to go through an incident report and see, at this particular point on a Monday, at this moment in time, the person, when accessing exchange/ews.asmx, had an NTLM v2 credential intercepted, which the attacker was able to decrypt via these mechanisms. I mean, we all in this room, many of us being in this industry, shake our heads and go, But it happens almost all the time. The ability to translate this stuff from technical jargon, which is very important. I mean, I spend my life doing it, to something that boards can actually appreciate and understand is maybe one that we're underinvested in security. What advice would you give some people in the room who might be more on my side of the fence in communicating security risk to the board? What should we avoid, or what language should we embrace?
I think you need to start with the impact. What could happen? Make it real as a particular impact. Money could be stolen, as it could by a number of other mechanisms. Data could be compromised, as it could by a number of other mechanisms. If you're in other industries, your power plant could be shut down. Your chemical factory could overheat. Make it real. Make the outcomes real, and then talk about how we are preventing those threats from occurring. I think it's really about switching it into real business impacts and then demonstrating the cyber route that enables that to happen.
And actually for banks, I mean, I think the security people working in banks have a built-in advantage over many other industries. Most senior people in banks got there because they're successful risk managers.
Right.
They're, as you mentioned earlier, market risk, credit risk, liquidity risk. They have that as a frame of reference. And if you can make the discussion about information security, cybersecurity, whichever name you want to give it, a risk management discussion, you put it into their frame of reference. A lot of us fail because we speak to everyone as if they understand our frame of reference, and that's just a bad starting point.
No, I very much agree. That's a cardinal sin, is to frame cyber risk from our own perspective and understanding, and being able to translate it to terms they already appreciate is going to work significantly better. Now, we have this title for the panel of how can industry fight back? And I think one of the key themes that has emerged in the past few years, but particularly in discussion between public and private sector, has been this challenge of information sharing, right? Because cyber criminals are incredibly good at this, right? They share information both on a commercial and a tactical basis. We'll often see campaigns where cyber criminal X makes a mistake in the implementation of their attack. A short while later, cyber criminal Y comes along and fixes it, and for some reason, the original gang goes and corrects that issue too. There are lines of communication there. Yet, both within our organizations and on a broader scale across industry, we can often be pretty siloed. So you've been very quiet so far. I know you've been waiting patiently. Kalyani, I'd like to bring you in here because I know in your role as CEO of Sabric, you've been really pioneering some very functional information sharing with competitors coming to the table that normally would be quite nervous about sharing this information. Sure. Tell me a little bit more about what you've been doing and what's working.
Sure. Thank you, James. Well, certainly we have a model that's probably fairly unique in the world. I think the UK has a similar organization. I know a number of countries are starting at the moment. But in South Africa, we have a very collaborative model amongst the banks. And currently, as it stands, SABRIC has 17 banks that participate, where information sharing is happening all the time on various different crime types. But because we're talking about cyber security and cybercrime, what we did was, the organization is 14 years old. And like I said, we have 17 banks that are part of it, all South African licensed banks. But about 3 or 3.5 years ago, we approached the CEOs of all of the member banks and said, we had a fraud committee where we interacted with the fraud and forensic resources within the banks, and we had what we call a violent crime committee, and that dealt with bank robberies and physical crimes. And we said we needed a new community at SABRIC because we were interacting with the physical security people, we were interacting with forensics and fraud, but we weren't talking to anybody from in respect of the technology side. So we weren't talking to the CIO, we weren't talking to the CISOs, and we knew that this was coming and that we needed to get off our butts and get this going. So fortunately for us, the CEOs of the banks bought into this completely and then allowed or gave the go-ahead, a directive for the CIOs and CISOs to form part of the community at SABRIC. And so that gave rise to a cybersecurity steering committee, which we currently have. Of course, we still have a long way to go, but I think we've made significant strides. What this committee actually does is that, well, like I said, it has senior resources on it, but it allows the banks who are competitors to come together and talk about common issues relating to the crimes that they face in each of their banks, on what the emerging threats are and how they're going to deal with it. So the steering committee decides on the priorities of what SABRIC should be focusing on and how it needs to be dealt with. But in addition to that, we have a CERT. So SABRIC formed a CERT, so we're a coordinating CERT. So each of the banks would obviously have their own operating CERTs. It feeds into the coordinating CERT enables the banks to know exactly what's going on in another bank. So all that information pours into the SABRIC database. But from a point of view of dealing with things almost real time, we have procedures in place where if a particular bank is experiencing a problem, something's going down, something's happening, that feeds in. The trust relationship is phenomenal. And when you work together so closely all of the time, you realize that there's no stigma in terms of reporting your incident, or if there's a possible threat, or if you've already had an exposure. And you have resources around you, experts, that are able to share and to talk about it, because there's no competition when it comes to fighting crime. So there's a number of things. And so while we deal with the issues around the implementation on building resilience on cybersecurity, and the focus is around looking at best practice in the world. We commissioned a cyber threat framework, which all of the banks measure against to look at where their gaps are, and also to lean on each other in terms of getting to where they need to go. We also deal with the issues around awareness. Katrina was talking about awareness on the external side. So we don't deal with, from a SABRIC perspective, awareness internally in the bank, but externally. So we take the brand out of creating the awareness. So it's not one particular bank that's going out in respect of phishing or any other kind of attack, internet banking, mobile banking, fraud. We do it from an industry perspective. From an economies of scale point of view, you save tons of money. We're very active on social media. We have a very nice campaign, and I would encourage everybody to follow us or to go and have a look at it, #Scale'em, where we talk from the perspective of a criminal, not just where we always say don't do this or do that. We're talking as if the criminal is talking. So it's very interesting and had great response. And then, of course, what we're doing now, one of the newer things that we're doing is that we're creating a central cybercrime risk incident repository, where all the banks will then feed in their incidents and stats, and we'll be able to do all the analysis and help them mitigate risk on their side. And again, really, it's working phenomenally at the moment. I know time's always an issue, but from a public partnership perspective, part of what we do is that we're the nodal point for the banks in developing the partnerships with government. So we have very close relations with the Department of State Security, with the Department of Telecommunications, who's the department responsible for setting up the certs. We've assisted them set up the cybersecurity hub. Expertise is always an issue, and the banking sector always has lots of expertise available. And so we offer this to government as well in terms of assisting to make sure that these are up and running, because it's to the banking sector advantage to have all of this in place. We also have very close relations with the police department, whether it's crime intelligence, whether it's the priority crimes unit. And just as an example, 2 Saturdays ago, intelligence department picked up some activity on the dark web, communications around possible attacks against South African banks.
I was hoping you were going to say the dark web.
So they communicated that very quickly through to us, and we have the ability to get all 17 banks up and running and monitoring their systems. People send their staff into the banks so that everybody's on high alert. It doesn't mean that we'll always be able to prevent, but it certainly is a great way in terms of how everybody's able to stand together. So I think the sharing of information, not just amongst the banking sector, you've got to make a start. And it's only when you actually start doing this that you realize the advantages of being able to do it, even if you're testing different solutions and capabilities. You have each other to bounce off. So it's a great way to go.
I think that's a very mature industry sharing model that you've constructed there, and I know there's more work to do, of course, but getting competitors to come to the table and both tactically, when a particular incident occurs, but also strategically discuss emerging threats, be able to work together to ward off cyber criminals is excellent. You look at a lot of the requests for information sharing that occur from governments, and there is, I think, a real paranoia around sharing information. I think we're quick to build up the walls because of the stigma of cybersecurity, to build up the walls and say, well, let's just do this ourselves and bury this information. It sounds very rosy today. I'm sure that the journey to getting there was not trivial. So both to you and to the rest of the panel, who I know are also involved in similar schemes and have opinions, I'm interested in what are the obstacles we have to overcome to be able to do more of that kind of valuable activity. Charles?
So, the FSISAC, which is the entity in the U.S., I think today has about 4,000 member banks that participate in information sharing. And obviously the larger banks do more of the output and the smaller banks do more of the input, which is a natural state. But there are sort of two very important constructs that sort of evolved. Because when the FSISAC was created in 2001, we spent a lot of money engineering a really secure way to communicate. But we didn't really think about the human factors. And the reality is humans are much more interested in sharing with other humans that they trust. And so one aspect of the evolution was this idea of sort of circles of trust, communities of trust that evolved. One evolved around payments. Recently, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, after a lot of retailer breaches, a whole retailer component got developed. So that's a piece of it. The other is for the person who is sharing to also have a method by which they can control the degree of which it is shared. So in the U.S. and the ISAC, and it's also been adopted in some other parts of the sort of sharing infrastructure, they developed something called the traffic light protocol. It's simple: red, yellow, green. When I send out the information, I just say it's TLP red, TLP amber, actually, I guess, and TLP green. And that allows me to control the distribution. Now, in a lot of ways, it's an honor system that people are living up to their obligation, but no one wants to be kicked out of the group, so no one is going to sort of violate that.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, once we created the traffic light protocol, the volume of sharing just went through the roof because people felt a little bit more confident about the fact that they were, in fact, in control. So I think that's one of the pieces you have to build into this.
Yeah, I love the traffic light system. I think that the circles of trust is key as well. I've really found that. I mean, if you look at the state of law covering this area, that, you know, a lot of us look to law to govern what we can and can't share a lot of the time, particularly in government relations. You find that law is ostensibly national and the internet is truly borderless. Crimes occur from anywhere. It's often very difficult to figure out even where the victim is or what jurisdiction applies. One of the things that makes a big difference is those personal connections with people of like interest trying to stop cyber criminals. And that opens up a lot of doors practically where some of that definition doesn't exist. And I'm curious, have you guys implemented some similar practices? Have you found that to be the case as well?
Well, certainly. I suppose we don't have the issue of jurisdictional issues because we're within the country. But certainly from a point of view of privacy, because you respect each client, your clients, each bank's clients, and so there's obviously important considerations there as well. But one of the things we do is that when we send out an alert, so if a particular bank is having an attack or has had an experience, and we send out an alert, which we do immediately, we don't disclose who the bank is. So the important thing is to know that something is happening. You don't have to know who it's happening to at that particular point. It's only when you reach a point of where the bank is happy for you to share who they are, then you do it. But I think the important thing is that you're able to do this, and that builds the trust, because then you know you can actually trust this particular way in which you're communicating. So
This is not a competitive advantage. No. This is the civilized world against the uncivilized, and we need to come together to fight it. I think we need to do the types of sharing that Charles is talking about. We also, I think, need to engage with government to look at the laws. And I'm not a proponent of cyber laws specifically, because I think we have enough law that talks about the impact of cyber. But where we do have problems is this jurisdictional stuff, the ability to have the same privacy laws so you can trace the money through multiple countries, the ability to prosecute across borders. I think those types of changes to law as the world becomes more global are going to become increasingly important as more and more of our life becomes digital.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the collective power of the industry working together to not only look at it from a prevention perspective, but also the collective power of being able to influence the deterrence, whether it be with the regulators or the various police forces. I think we shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah, I think there's huge power in that. There are some challenges. I dealt with a very nasty case a few weeks ago where an elderly gentleman was unfortunately the victim of a scam. He received a communication from his solicitor in relation to selling a property, and this communication said, please transfer the money to this bank account with this name. He transferred the money, and it transpired that particular communication was from the law firm's domain name with an extra letter on the end. Really tough little thing to spot. Now, this kind of flowed off to the bank, and he contacted the bank. The money had disappeared, gone through the standard mule networks and processes that cyber criminals love to use. And he said to the bank, well, I sent it with this sort code and account code. The name doesn't match the owner of this account. How could that possibly happen? And in his eyes, all three of those things were being used as an authentication primitive, as trust, when in reality, only two of them were validated. And what followed from that was a very interesting experience of him trying to find someone in the police to talk to about it. And he went to the local police and said, I have this problem. Who should I talk to? They went, cybercrime? What is this botnet of which you speak, and where can we find him? Went to a larger police force, equal confusion, eventually got to the right people who were under-resourced and uninterested in a crime of less than hundreds of thousands, spoke to the bank, who exercised some duty of care, but ultimately advised him to go to the police force. And there's this chicken and egg problem of, I need a police number, but I think it's actually quite difficult for the average person or the average small business even to know how to start in sharing this kind of information with us. And maybe some of that's the law, maybe some of it's communication.
Well, think how the police response would have been different if that had been somebody who'd broken down his door and stolen that money from under his bed.
Sure.
Then it would be a mainstream crime.
Sure.
But it's no different. But at the moment it is different, and we need to find a way of making those two things, and the response is the same.
One of the things that we also find that's easier to do from a banking perspective also is help to train and to brief law enforcement on all the different crime types as they come up. So as the different modus operandi surface, we have the ability on behalf of the banks, and we pull in resources from the banks as well if we need to. So we do all these different training and briefing sessions to try and keep the police. Of course, you have a long way to go there as well, but at least it's certainly a way to keep them up to date in terms of some of the crime types. If you walk into a police station, like you say, and you have a young constable or someone in a local police station receiving a complaint that you've been a victim of a botnet, I mean, they honestly don't know what you're talking about. So,
and it's not everywhere. Some places have done a phenomenal job, but it is a common challenge. As we're moving towards summation and question time, I do have a question that I really want to ask. And it's a bit of a mean one, but I think you'll like it. So we talked about a lot of good stuff, right? We talked about models for information sharing, some things that you can practically do to encourage people to information share. We talked about the importance of security awareness and how you can make that more engaging and how you should address the board. There are lots of things here, many of which aren't bleeding edge new things here in 2016. We didn't just think of them. Why do more companies, more firms, more organizations not adopt these practices? Why don't they take the top 10 simple things they could do in security control terms and execute them? And how do we incentivize people to start to do this stuff, which we know will have an impact and we know is good? Is it about sanctions and fines or public naming and shamings in the press? Is it capital allocations? I found out what that was earlier. That was interesting. I learned something there. How do we actually move the needle with people in adopting some of this good stuff?
Well, we've just spoken for the last 10 minutes about collaboration across the industry. I'm really not a believer in imposing these large financial fines. When you think about, what those that have been imposed over the last number of years, you have to ask yourself, well, what exactly has that achieved? Has it achieved greater security? Probably not. So again, it goes back to that, for me, that collaborative model, working together, setting standards. Obviously, each case revolves around it on its own merits, and I'm not suggesting, some organisations who have failed to exercise due process should not be penalised in some form. But really, if you want to boost your balance sheet or your P&L, it's just not really sending the right message, in my opinion.
Interesting.
So I think there are two sides to this equation. So there's the motivation piece. You can have negative enforcement, which doesn't always work. Any of us who are parents understand the limitations of negative enforcement, fines, sanctions, or whatever, or positive enforcement. But there's also a capability question. The reality is, I don't remember where I read this statistic, but I read something saying, roughly speaking, there's a global shortfall of 2 million information security professionals. All right. what we're talking about is relatively simple. But if you are in a firm where the CISO happens to be the CIO, also happens to be the ONT head, also happens to be 3 other things, there's a capability issue there. And I think part of the problem is that you have a handful of large firms that have built large, complex, sophisticated security programs who, through these different information sharing methods, try to share out. But then you've got a lot of small firms that don't have the possibility. And I'll give you the simplest example. In 2012 and 2013, the government of Iran launched a series of DDoS attacks against financial services firms, primarily in the US. There were 1 or 2 UK firms that were their response to sanctions that were being placed on the government of Iran for their nuclear program. The FSISAC, through its intelligence partners, was monitoring the botnets. We were helping firms and we were teaching firms about how to protect themselves. But there was a small bank, I think in Missouri somewhere, who accidentally had the exact same name as a very large Boston bank. And the Iranians mistargeted. And so even though we were able to warn that bank, there was no capability on their part to defend themselves.
Right.
And so there is this motivation question, and I'd be a much bigger proponent of positive motivation. But we also have to figure out how we deal with this capability gap so that it's not just large firms that have ability to defend themselves, but it's medium-sized firms and it's small firms who all make up critical parts of this ecosystem you all operate in.
Yeah, I think differentiating between those who do the right things at their station and capability level, because we can't expect every firm to operate at that same pinnacle, who become unfortunate victims and should have an arm put around them, and those who have been nigh on negligent in their information security practice, is quite a challenging thing to do. And I expect with this charge of law, like the GDPR in Europe, to disclose this more and more, we probably have a few interesting years ahead of us in making mistakes and miscategorizing people in both those buckets. And it's probably a mash of all those different techniques that will ultimately lead to success. I do want to just take a couple of minutes here. We've covered a lot of topics. We've jumped through information sharing. We've jumped through communicating with the board, security awareness. If you could give a brief, token of wisdom or a closing sentiment to our audience here at Sibos in how the industry can fight back, something that these guys can take back and do in their company next week, or something you want them to think about, I'd just like to step through our panel here and give you a chance to offer one wonderfully punchy sentiment to the audience. Charles, if I may start with you.
Educate your board of directors about the fact that no matter how good you are, you can have a bad day. And to focus on detection and response, to practice. Don't think about a bad day for the first time when it's happening to you. Practice. Use that practice as a way to educate your board, educate your seniors, and I think that would be my one line.
Excellent advice. Steve?
So bring cyber into the mainstream. Perhaps stop talking about it as cybersecurity and talk about it as security, and focus on the impacts and what can happen, because this will be part of what defines whether companies will exist in the long term, whether consumers have trust to operate with them in an increasingly digital world.
Excellent advice. Kiliani?
I think it's vitally important to ensure that within the banks that your physical security resources, your fraud and forensic resources, and your technology, your CISOs and your CIOs, all start meeting and talking, because these crimes are running across. So irrespective of whether it's card that's compromised, there's the digital and the cyber angle to it. So it's vitally, vitally important that those three divisions now start having an opportunity and a forum to interact very closely together.
Excellent. And certainly, last but not, and you don't have that face of the panelist where I've been at the end of the panel where you go, they said my thing. And you have to quickly think of something. So that's good. You look very calm and collected. So
for me, my message is recognize that cyber criminals are 1, if not 10 steps ahead of us. And therefore, don't assume that what you have in place today will protect you tomorrow. I would urge you to have a continuous awareness program, continuous investment. It isn't going to go away.
very prudent advice. There you go. Lots of sage words. Hopefully you can capture those and repeat them as your own knowledge later. That's the point, right? No licensing and attribution required. So I know we're running up to time here, and I want to leave some time for questions, as I'm sure several of you have some. We'll get a roaming mic out and running in just a second. My closing thought to you is this. We're talking about lots of things here that aren't necessarily new in the industry, right? They're ideas that have been around for a while. How does the industry fight back? I would love to be in the position, as I'm sure all my fellow panelists would as well, to be talking about bleeding edge new ideas and things that we absolutely just came up with. I think the biggest challenge is getting each of us, each of our firms, each of us as individuals to act. There are all these things on the panel we've talked about here that most firms simply aren't doing. So I would implore you, when you get back to the office, think about information sharing, find out what schemes you participate in, whether you should be running such a scheme. Have a look at your information security awareness processes and whether you adhere to this best practice. And think closely about how these things are reported to the board, the language that is used here. And if everyone leaving the room does just that, we will make life a little bit harder for cyber criminals, which would make me personally very happy. So with that, if we just bring the lights up a tad, and I saw some very keen hands raised already. You were, I think, slightly first, and I'll be right with you. If we could bring a mic over here. And if I could ask you to just give us your name and the organization you're from, please.
Hi there, I'm Ada. I'm from CIBC Canadian Bank. I just have a question. I heard a lot of good things about working with the banks, the government, and the police station. Do we ever consider working with the education system? Because that's the most important thing. I think hackers is still treated as the cool guy still right now. And all the Hollywood movies, Ant-Man, all the hackers are the good people, actually. So I think ultimately, if we want to make sure there's a mainstream crime, we really need to do a lot more to educate our kids, which I'm sure that most of them are smart kids in those areas. To educate them, this is really the wrong thing to do.
That's a very good point. There is very much a hacker fan culture. Any thoughts from our panel?
One of the things we actually do is that we work quite closely with the Banking Association in South Africa. And they run a number of programs, part of their CSI programs with the education department, and even built into school curriculums. And we go in, Sabric goes in as part of the partner with the Banking Association, and we create this awareness. We haven't started with junior school, but we do it at high school level. It hasn't been rolled out extensively, but we've already had some material written into the syllabus that they're using, even as part of a spelling bee, where we've put in different crime types and given the definitions of it and starting to get kids to understand what's going on, or more high school rather. But yeah, I think there's still a fair amount to do, but
there's a lot of work to be done there. There is definitely a start. And
I think it's a very valid question. I actually think it starts in the home. You think it's all about behaviours. So children are given applying phones and what have you at a very very young age. They emulate their parents. I mean, how many of us have downloaded music, it might not necessarily be deemed as cybercrime, but it's effectively where it starts. So.
I remember being a 14-year-old and being redirected just at the right moment by a luck intervention from hacking to cybersecurity. I've said it on national television. We'd be having a very different conversation if a particular person didn't tap me on the shoulder at that point in time. So I think that is a very much a key issue. I think there's some good starts to this, but I think we need to do a lot more across all of society and certainly with kids in schools. Gentleman down here had a question as well. You were equally keen. Yes, you just buy a tick.
Well, we're at Sibos, aren't we? So I'd like to maybe ask a question relating to Swift and the community. So firstly, I'm Rob Kotlarts at Bottom Line Technologies. We're active in the fraud space. As we've met with the major banks at the show, we've felt a lot of the pain and the resonance of what's happened with the Bangladesh fraud. I'd like to ask the panel, what do they perceive should be the role of Swift going forward? Some organizations have said to us, for example, Swift have a lot of data about the messages passing between counterparties. Should they be leveraging that data? Other organizations are saying to us that they think payment anomaly detection is important, looking for patterns in the payment messages. What would be the view of the panel around Swift's role in collaboration? What should the industry drive forward? How much should be done in the network and how much should be done in the bank?
Well, I'm happy to offer panelists a chance to comment. On the Swift-specific aspects, I don't think any of us can probably field that one, as we're not from that organization, although I'd encourage you to hook up with one of the numerous people in the room here or head to the stand and discuss it. On the broader point of where should this problem be thwarted? Is it central? Is it the network? You know, more generally, I'm very keen on your thoughts. I'm feeling probably all of the aforementioned, but any thoughts?
I think that's the only right answer. It is everywhere. I mean, it's highly complex. It's not tied to Swift. I mean, it's an issue that is much broader than it. I mean, Swift-specific things, yeah, I'd agree, talk to Swift about, but it's everything. There are things you could potentially do in the network. There are things you could do at the correspondent banks, the initiating banks, or corporations. Any one of them by themselves doesn't solve it.
It's about layers, I think, isn't it? It's about having... You can't just stop them at the front door. You have to detect them when they're in. Then you have to stop the impact of the thing that they're trying to do. You have to have layers, and it's across the entire ecosystem. I don't think it can sit in one particular part, as that example demonstrated. The more we can build those types of layers, and the more that we work together as an industry, I think the better.
Yeah. Defense in depth is a good model here. Someone over here had a question as well. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Dan Moran from Swift. So kind of the thing we're talking about now a lot is the fraud. Maybe a year ago or a little more, we were talking about data breaches like Sony, where it was about humiliating or embarrassing and disrupting. Before that, it was about infrastructure attacks and denial of service. Are we in kind of a culture of short attention spans and flavor of the month with this?
Sorry, there was a squirrel over there, and ladies and gentlemen, thoughts on that? Short attention span. Are we chasing the issue of the moment rather than being long-termist in our definition of cybercrime and the issues?
We are very much in a reactionary space, I think, at the moment, as much as it's difficult to say that. But again, I believe that through a collective pooling of resource and knowledge, we will never get ahead of them, but certainly we can. I mean, obviously we don't think like these criminals, but we can deploy new methodologies and tools to at least be as proactive as we can.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard not to chase down the latest thing that's happened and make sure that can't happen here. You hear that quite a lot. And I think it goes back to that conversation with the board, setting the appetite across the wide range of potential cyber attacks that can occur and the underlying impacts that can come from that. The broader that conversation can be, the less likely you are to be looking over here while people are doing something over there.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. I think simultaneously trying to focus on the long-term pains whilst invariably going after the reactive short-term. I mean, our industry is by definition reactive to cybercriminals. It's going to happen. Is a mature approach. I see more hands shooting up, but we are 30 seconds from the end of our session here. So if you do want to try and hit us up afterwards, I'm sure that a number of us would be happy to answer some questions. But would like to thank you very much for coming to the session today. I do hope that you got a few nuggets you can take away, some things that you can do when you get back to the office. And I'm sure I look forward to the coming years where we'll be discussing a different set of practices, having implemented some of these wondrous things. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. A round of applause very much. And please do enjoy the rest of the day. And if you could remember, please remember to rate the session in the mobile app as you leave here. But do enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, everyone.